Today, we have an amazing group of experts, both here and online, that will be talking about the new, exciting vulnerability exchange work that many of us are doing. So some announcements before we start. Please silence your cell phones and be respectful to the panel as we're talking. We're going to start off with some questions directed to the panelists that they will answer. But at any time folks have thoughts or feels, please kind of raise your hand and Val will help us with the microphone. Note that we are being live streamed, so we have a cast of hundreds potentially on the internet watching it. They're all watching the EPSS. Don't fool yourselves. But we have folks on the internet watching live stream. So as you have questions, and reminder to the panelists, please use the microphone so that we can be respectful of our friends virtually. And with that, let's get started and talk about VEX. Just a quick question as we start intros. Has anyone here heard of VEX? You stumbled into the right session? All right. I'm going to have the panelists just do a brief introduction about themselves, kind of what they're doing with VEX and their experiences, and then we will get into the questions. We'll start off with Puerco.
Hey, my name is Adolfo Garcia, or Puerco, and I'm here on behalf of the OpenVEX project, which is one of the VEX flavors.
Okay. Hi, Art Manion. I am at the moment government contractor. I support CISA, my favorite, best customer of all time. Partly for SBOM work and VEX work. I single-handedly co-chair the VEX community working group, and I get to sort of help with others involved write what VEX is without having to actually try to do it. So easy spot for me. Yeah.
First of all, welcome everyone. Justin Murphy with DHS CISA. As Art mentioned, we do some work together and have a lot of fun. Puerco is also very much involved with our community work and has been a really important contributor. I work in vulnerability management for the CVD team, but I also I used to be involved for the last couple of years in the SBOM VEX work. Also sit on the a member of a couple standards bodies through OASIS, one of those being the Common Security Advisory Framework. Have some of my friends, members of the TC here. I also sit on the OpenEOX, the new TC co-chair of that group. So really excited to be here today to talk about VEX.
And next up, hopefully the internet works. Mr. Springett, Steve, are you on?
I am on. Can you hear me?
Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, my wife is out of the country and I have a sick kid. So, you know, the gods had, something else planned for me for today. Steve Springett, I'm Director of Product Security at ServiceNow. I'm on the OWASP Board of Directors. And I guess for those that may know me, I do a lot of work within the Cyclone DX bill of materials space. And I've been doing open source for, entirely too long, 20 years or so.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we had invited someone representing the SPDX, which is another one of the tools in this space, and they were unable to attend. So anyone knows about SPDX, feel free to raise your hand or provide that community's unique feedback as we move along. All right. So I have a series of directed questions. If the audience or the internet has ideas or questions they want to do, please raise your hand or put it on the Discord server. My first question is to Mr. Manion, our working group's fearless leader. For those of the audience that don't understand the nuance behind it, Art, could you please explain what VEX is and why this is a new useful tool in communicating vulnerability data?
Thank you for the question there, Krob. I don't really think there's a whole lot of nuance. There's a lot of talk about VEX and there's some stuff written down for sure, but I have a pretty simple description of it, right? I'm going to guess a lot of folks in this room either produce or consume sort of vulnerability status information, right? I've got a vulnerability, maybe it's got a CVE ID. I have some pieces of software, maybe they have IDs, whole different discussion. And, what is the status of that software with regard to the vulnerability, right? We read and write lots of advisories. There's lots of ways to do this. It's pretty haphazard. But we all want to convey that status. Is this software affected? Is it not affected? Even better. Is it under investigation? And VEX does go a little further. If it's not affected, justify that a bit. Tell me why. But VEX is really vulnerability status in hopefully a more standard and possibly machine readable way. So it's not asking for anything new. It's not asking for different timing or different disclosure or publication procedures other than if I'm going to convey or I'm going to consume vulnerability status about software, hey, try using VEX to do that.
Anyone else have thoughts they want to add?
Yeah, I'll add just very little to that because Art did such a great job. But I think it came out of the SBOM work, this concept of VEX. Although VEX is something that PCERT's security teams are doing, you're exchanging information about vulnerabilities. But the concept of VEX really came out of that notion that we really needed a way to communicate if, two questions you're trying to answer for any security team is, are my products at risk? And if so, what do I need to do about it? Which is, we're really concerned about that second question. And that's where the need for VEX really came, was a way to communicate that information of, is this vulnerability affecting my product? Or just as important, as Art mentioned, is it not? And do I have, am I off the hook for now? I think also just the dynamic nature of the landscape of vulnerabilities too. The need for VEX to address that is really important too. So,
Yeah, I don't know if Steve has thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I can contribute, but I always looked at VEX as if you're being transparent with your SBOMs, consumers are going to scan and analyze those SBOMs, and oh my God, there's a bunch of alerts. This software is horrible because I've got 100 CVEs, right? As we all know, third-party libraries, even if they are vulnerable, may not necessarily be vulnerable in the context of the application that they're running in. So VEX is a way to essentially turn the lights off, right? To make the conversation a little bit more focused from the consumer's perspective.
And I would just add that another important factor is the time factor of VEX. So it's not about just the ultimate status, but it also lets you know the evolution of the knowledge that we have about that exploitability.
Excellent. Thank you, panel. My second question, I'll start off with Steve, please. From your perspective, how do you see VEX integrating and or complementing existing formats, standards, and specs? You touched on a little bit about transparent SBOMs. Could you maybe expand on how you see VEX integrating with other well-known vuln formats and things?
Yeah, so, as we kind of become more transparent with the ingredients in our software, or if we have other kind of regulatory transparent requirements that are not necessarily SBOM, but other kind of mechanisms that we need to be transparent with our software about, VEX is kind of a way to communicate, the things that the software consumers should really care about. Right. If you scan a piece of software, you're going to come up with a bunch of potential issues. VEX is really, in my opinion, a little bit more focused. So I think it complements a lot of the work from not only the SBOM, work, but honestly, it actually ties in really well to a lot of the PCERT functions that a lot of us know and kind of live on a day-to-day basis. Because essentially that's what this is, right? It's about triage and about identifying, exploit paths and communicating outwards. Does this really affect me? So it's not just, in my opinion, really about the formats, but I look at VEX more as an evolution of the processes that are kind of inherent in organizations that develop software.
Yeah. Sorry, real briefly. I thank you, panel, for helping me more fully explain VEX. Right. A piece of software can have a dependency with a known vulnerability. You might argue, strictly speaking, that product, the final product, is vulnerable but not exploitable. And I think that's one of the nuances VEX is trying to get to. And Justin and Steve both hit it very well. But right, if SBOM or other scanning is going to reveal tons and tons and tons of known CVEs upstream, and the collection of CVEs is large, I'm wasting a lot of time trying to investigate all of those. If VEX can cut off a whole bunch of that stuff as not exploitable, that was, I think, really the original SBOM origin of the need for VEX. So there is a subtle distinction between, right, technically, sure, that vulnerable code is sitting in there somewhere, but we've decided it's unreachable, not exploitable for certain reasons. And VEX lets us convey that nuance without having to say the vulnerability is literally removed right from the upstream code. So,
Thanks, gentlemen. My next question I'm going to toss to Puerco first. Since being an active developer here, we talk about personas a lot in the development space. So thinking about different personas from your understanding, how do you think VEX helps the developer persona? And then I'll talk to maybe Justin. He could talk about suppliers. And then maybe Steve could talk about from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, as developers, there's a lot of areas where VEX can help. So the first one is like when you do the triaging and receiving vulnerability reports in your products and your projects, you can capture the impact just once and communicate it. It lets you handle and quench false positives that people may be reporting against your project. And this one is a really big one because if you see in open source projects, often the vulnerabilities will be reported on and on again. And I guess the other final one would be to give more assurance to the next link in the supply chain of how you're affected or not.
Yeah, so I mean, I like to always pick an example when looking at it from these different perspectives, but although I think it could be applied to all of them. Log4j, we've heard of it. I think that we all experienced some level of needing to communicate information and communicate it quickly, but also combating the need to find out if we were actually affected by it. We already talked about how VEX helps to address that, and needing to find that information out quickly. So one thing that VEX introduces is also the idea of greater automation into the ecosystem, machine readability, and we're going to, I assume, talk about some of the tools that are existing and that we represent that are going to help you do that or already do help you do that. So I think from the supplier's perspective, we're getting hounded. Maybe that's not only from our customers, but also from on high, talking about, hey, I read in the news about this media hyped vulnerability. Are we affected? What are you doing about it? Blah, 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 right? And so it is going to help you communicate some really important information. Like we've already said, are you affected? Are you not affected? Under investigation, which I think is maybe, the ones we harp on is the ability to say affected, not affected. I think under investigation is a really important status to be able to communicate. Hey, leave us alone while we find out. in a way, I think that's a really valuable status, especially from the supplier perspective, right there. So I'll turn it over to Art for the next perspective.
Steve, if you could maybe describe from a consumer perspective what you think the benefits to VEX would be for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to agree on the the triage, the under investigation kind of view, because as a consumer, right, I think initially the expectation, the unrealistic expectation is that you have vulnerable free software, right? And that's just not practical. It's not within the scope of most organizations to even accomplish. However, I think the value of VEX is more about that long tail type of trending. You can use the under investigation type of analysis decision in a VEX to assemble a timeline of, is this vendor responsive, right? And answer these types of questions so that you are essentially establishing whether or not this supplier is trustworthy or not, right? Are they responsive to the CVEs that are coming out? What is the mean time for, once a CVE becomes published, when does that VEX say that it's under investigation? You can measure this type of activity, and that's, from a consumer's perspective, I think that's, in my opinion, a lot more valuable than trying to aim for a vulnerable free type of software.
Those are some excellent points, gentlemen. Anything to add, Art?
Real briefly, yes. I mean, I was reading some text today that implied that vulnerability-free software might be a thing and it should be expected somewhere. Yeah, that's the reaction, but it was an important document that said this. Anyway, but yeah, instead, hey, look, software has vulnerabilities, right? What's the status of these things? We have a lot of volume, more automated, more machine readable, under investigation. You don't have to call support, wait till the VEX changes. You'll have your answer. Is a better, it's a management answer, not a perfection. Defect-free, vulnerability-free software is not practical. So
that's excellent. Thank you. As Justin alluded to, the gentlemen here on the panel represent some ecosystems, some tools, some ideas, implementations of VEX. So I'd like you each to briefly kind of explain what distinguishes your particular tool, what you do, or what you're maybe particularly trying to address. We'll start with CSAF, then we'll do Cyclone and OpenVEX, and SPDX is also in the mix, but we don't have anyone to talk about that yet.
You want me to start?
Please.
Yeah, sure. So I represent and sit on the OASIS Common Security Advisory Framework Technical Committee. If you haven't, quick question: who's heard of CSAF? If you've been in this room this week, you've heard of it. I'm sure you've heard of all these different tools and formats. So CSAF, if you are not familiar with CSAF, you might be familiar with CVRF. It's a successor for CVRF, the Common Vulnerability Reporting Framework. It is a international open and free standard out of the OASIS Open Standards Organization. And one of the implementations of VEX. CSAF is broken into several different profiles. There's 5 of them. One of the more common use cases is, of course, security advisory, and then also VEX. That's profile 4, security advisory, and profile 5 of VEX. It really, if you're looking at it from a CSAF perspective, it is a security advisory document with the additional information of status of the vulnerability. And that's, if we're looking at it from the CSAF perspective, we sort of see it as each profile builds on one another. And so that's an important complementary aspect of the importance of both pieces of that information. I think, but the really important part of VEX is addressing I heard Adolfo mention it in his presentation earlier, that sort of chain, the dynamic nature of vulnerabilities that can change, right? And so that chain of communication that needs to happen. And so you can communicate in a machine readable, automated way. Is this the status of this product? Has it been determined that it's affected, not affected, fixed, under investigation? CSAF is it's free. It's open source. It is developed out of the technical committee, but we do take contributions. You can go to the GitHub repository, submit issues, submit pull requests. We look at them and we discuss those as part of the TC. We are currently the 2.0 version 2.0 is what is being fully implemented right now in the ecosystem. We're working on version 2.1. The TC is currently discussing some of the updates, some of the features that we're going to be adding, and we will be voting on what we're going to incorporate and things like that. A couple of those pertain to VEX, and we will be discussing those in the near future. Hopefully we get version 2.1 out quickly. Right now, 2.0 though is what is being used in the ecosystem. I know we have some of you in the audience are implementing CSAF. Some of you, we heard from Cassie yesterday, talking about how Schneider's doing some VEX information using CSAF. We know Siemens, we know Red Hat CSAF VEX. Rogue talked about it. Hoping Martin touches on it a little bit later. So that's CSAF. I'll turn it over to Steve.
So yeah, Cyclone DX, also open source. It's been around since around 2018 or so. It comes out of the security community, specifically the OWASP Foundation. It is primarily targeted toward all of the security use cases, although it does a bunch of other things as well. It is a full stack bill of materials specification. So it does hardware, software, services, the latest AI and ML, for example. The latest version, which will be out in a few weeks, also handles cryptography. So you can do a cryptographic bill of material, which is referenced in NIST 1838B, for example, for post-quantum cryptography readiness. Cyclone DX is kind of evolving from a full stack bill of materials specification to more of a transparency expression language. We are adding a bunch of things in 1.7 that really have nothing to do with bill of material, but are really, really important for software and system transparency. The vulnerability support in Cyclone has been there for a while. It's really designed to engage the developers so that they know what is broken and how to fix it. One of the challenges that if you've ever worked for a software company, you kind of know if you get a pen test report or some other kind of thing, right? The organization gives you a PDF and you hand that to the developers and they kind of throw it back at you, right? Because it's not in JIRA. They can't take action upon it. Well, the vulnerability support in Cyclone was really designed to eliminate that kind of process so that you can get this information into the JIRA backlog as quickly as possible so that developers can actually remediate that. Part of the vulnerability support of Cyclone is in fact VEX, but it is a smaller subset of what Cyclone DX is capable of. For anyone that wants to get involved in Cyclone DX, all OWASP working groups are open to anyone to participate. You do not have to be an OWASP member. Standardization is being handled by ECMA International, specifically TC54, which is on target to make Cyclone DX an international standard.
Talk about OpenVEX.
Yeah, so I guess I would contrast OpenVEX being the exact opposite that what Steve just mentioned. So OpenVEX could not care less about the JSON that it's handing you. We'll of course give you guarantees on stability of the format that we use, but it tries to be as minimal as possible. So we designed the format to be JSON LD. So the idea is if you can not have the information in there, and for example, in VEX you would have the product, which is the software that you're talking about in the VEX statement. We have the capability and we decided that if we can rely and just point to a component in an SBOM, the better. If we can just only have a reference to a vulnerability, the better. So we only have those references. We don't, OpenVEX doesn't try to be an advisory, doesn't want to replace the SBOM. It's attempting to be as minimal as possible because we want that information to be as compact as we can so that we can attach it and embed it in other attestations and ship it efficiently with other things. OpenVEX tries to be independent of both SBOM formats so that it can evolve on its own pace, because we're trying, the ultimate mission of OpenVEX is trying to help open source developers overcome the gaps in adopting VEX. So we're more interested in investing in building the tools that solve the problems, like discoverability, like assembling the documents, mixing them, finding, querying them, all of those things into the project. So that's what we're attempting to do. So,
An echo.
Okay.
that person sounded like
He really knew what he was talking about.
That's fabulous, fabulous speaking.
And there's one additional tool / format, SPDX. It's an open source project of the Linux Foundation that also not only does SBOMs, but has the capability of issuing VEX statements. We are sad that our representative from SPDX project couldn't be here to participate. Any rough ideas you could add, Art?
Yeah. So actually, let me be wise about this. Anyone else in the room care to know more about SPDX and VEX than I might? It's a low bar, I promise. Right. You know,
Can you spell it?
It crossed my mind. Oh, sorry. I mean, let me do my bit, but yes. So I apologize. In the CISA SBOM VEX community working group, we're currently halfway through a project of, interviewing folks who are doing VEX and asking them how it's working and what's going on. We've learned a lot of stuff, and we've learned that multiple formats are in use, and we've learned some things are working, some things are not. And SPDX thoughtfully responded to us, except I don't have it handy or didn't read it carefully. It probably says something, hopefully Puerco, like under development. I don't know if it's released into a full release of SPDX yet, but my understanding overall is SPDX and SBOM format and other things will support VEX very soon now. Is that close? Yeah.
Yeah. So just as the Cyclone, the upcoming release of SPDX is going to have also support for security information. There's a whole security. SPDX 3 has support for profiles. So you have a lean core, and then you have profiles that can augment the functions that the format does. And the security is one of them. They also have one for AI and the functional safety, for example. And inside of the security profile, there's a VEX implementation. And it's the way, so it's interesting to see how it's wired in there. So full disclosure, I advise them from OpenVEX to make sure that the implementation in SPDX conforms to the CISA minimum elements. So the way it works is that SPDX3 is a graph, and then all of those relationships are loaded with the VEX data. So for anybody who's a graph nerd, should take a look at how it is implemented. It's really, really interesting. And it actually, SPDX3 had its RC2 release 2 weeks ago or so, and it has the VEX capability in it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate the perspectives on the different implementations. Art touched on my next question, so I'll start with him. Could you, from your perspectives, and we'll start with Art, who's managing the working group, what is the current state of VEX today? Is anyone issuing VEXs? And if I was a downstream of someone issuing these, how could I get that?
Yeah, so I think that the simple overall answer is it's fairly new, right? We have these implementations. That's great. We have I'll dare call it a specification, although, that technically might not be correct, but you can read about the fields you're supposed to have and which are the recommended and which are required. There is use. I have looking up the spreadsheet of the Google form responses to see if I learned anything about SPDX, but we have use. I would say it is on the production of VEX side. And for the most part, when we have someone come and tell us how they're producing VEX, and you mentioned some of the folks earlier, some suppliers, Red Hat's a great example. They are in favor of consuming VEX, but don't have someone to consume it from yet. And, I think that's not surprising given that it's a fairly new concept and idea and specification so far. So people are producing it. I think it's safe to say we're mostly seeing it, right? Software producers of some kind who are already trying to automate their security advisory process, right? Customer information about security state of things. They're already automating that in the first place, and they're picking VEX, or they're picking CSAF to get the advisory format as well. That's where we're seeing sort of most of the responses coming in. But also our effort is possibly not statistically perfectly valid because we're wandering around looking for people we know who might respond, and it's there's probably some sample bias in there. But again, a lot of production, mostly, generally speaking, tied to I'm automating my security information anyway. I'm going to explore VEX to do this.
Yeah, I have some context about folks who have approached the project to looking for advice on how to use it. And we have some use cases. So first of all, we have the support in scanners. So Trivi and Gripe will ingest the OpenVEX documents. And based on that, some companies are using that to the most. So we have some projects and people producing those documents. We are trying to identify the gaps to have the fully automated flow from generation to consumption in the scanner. We're getting there. It's almost there. But there are some isolated cases of, for example, folks. And so I think the most iconic one that I've been showing is the isovalent case. So isovalent will has a VEX feed for Cilium and I think Tetragon as well. Some of the biggest problems. These are cloud native projects for those who are not familiar. And the way they do them, the way they do VEX is they will do the assessments and the triages of vulnerabilities and capture that into their master VEX feed. And then when they got a release, they will process that and based on the VEX information, assess if the release can be should be stopped or not based on the triaging.
Yeah, I'll speak both from a CISA perspective and a CSAP perspective. I think for us at CISA, first of all, we do have some through the VEX working group. We have some documents out there. We have a minimum elements for VEX. We have a use case document. Probably needs some revisiting, but hey, I think a lot of those use cases are still valid, not comprehensive, but valid. We have status justification document. We have a newly, somewhat newly, November, I think of last year, when to issue a VEX document. Yep. So there's some information out there, cisa.gov/SBOM, and you can find those documents available. I think from our perspective, you are going to notice, hopefully, a lot of emphasis, a lot of promotion of the need for machine readability in the ecosystem, and VEX is a huge part of that. One thing, our goal is to make it easier for you, but we, at the same time, have to make it easier for you to make it easier for you, if that makes sense. And that's a big problem of having to identify the ways that we can do that. I think I use the word promotion. I think one thing that we could really stand to find out is how do we not only promote but attract people to use VEX and to ask if you're a consumer to ask your vendors to produce VEX. From a CSAP perspective, we have a tool called SecVisigram. I would tell you that I think it's a great tool. I've used it quite a bit, and so therefore I understand it and can tell you how to do it. Or I say I'll produce you a VEX document. If you've never used it before, there's a learning curve. I know some friends in the audience would probably agree with that who've been to some of our workshops. If you know my colleague Thomas Schmidt with BSI, he has driven a lot of the advocacy and tool development for VEX. That's an area that we really need a lot of help with in the ecosystem as well, is tooling. Art mentioned what we're hearing is there's a lot of progress in the production side for VEX. That's great. We love hearing that, but we need a lot more progress in the consumption and distribution side of VEX. So that's, I think, somewhat accurate. Of the
yeah, I would have to agree with that. Absolutely. So, the ideas behind VEX are certainly not new. Are you vulnerable to this third-party library? What's new, I think, is like standardizing what are the types of information that should and should not be, in a VEX. The OWASP dependency track project, which is a platform that consumes, analyzes SBOMs. It's in use by 10,000 plus organizations today. And it's had this capability prior to the existence of VEX. And a large percentage of organizations that develop software use this capability. So I kind of see this as a two-part question. One, do you have the data? Do you have the analysis data? And two, are you formulating that data into a VEX file and then actually distributing that? I think we're doing really well, in my opinion, on the first part of the problem. But again, I see very little activity in terms of generating an actual VEX file, and more importantly, distributing that out to the downstream consumers.
Thank you, Steve. While I've got you on the line, I'll toss the next question for you to start. I want you to put your wizard hat on and get out your crystal ball. And where do you see VEX going in the next 5 or so years?
Well, obviously we all hope, everyone on this panel hopes that the adoption of VEX continues regardless of format, right? Format out the window, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is, the consumer experience. That said, over the next 5 years, I think as someone who works for an enterprise software company, I will tell you that issuing VEX is really expensive, and it's going to possibly change the way that software companies actually support multiple versions of a given software product. If anyone is in the audience, there is a call to action here. There is a lack of tools that exist that can validate that prior analysis decisions that I've made are still accurate today. So if I said that this vulnerability is not exploitable, right, because maybe it's the code execution path is not there, whatever, once I make that decision, 5 minutes later, that decision might actually be wrong because maybe the developer actually committed a change. We have tools like static analysis that are designed to find technical issues in source code. We have tons of these types of things. What we don't have today are tools that can take a VEX analysis and still determine whether or not that analysis decision is still valid. Now, you can do some of this with IaaS tools and actually do instrumentation at runtime, but in reality, very few of us run these types of tools. So in the absence of that, I think over the next 5 years, there's kind of an opportunity for tool vendors to innovate on making VEX a lot more economical for software suppliers.
I'll, couple brief things. My brain's in a state I have to write things down. Even minutes later, I'll forget them. 5 years. I mean, there's an easy prediction. Since it's so early stage, right? I do predict some degree of more adoption of VEX or similar automated ways to convey this information. Steve hit on a super important point. Unfortunately, VEX is not magic, and it doesn't perform the analysis for you. So, am I affected or not is still an investigation that has to be performed. Yeah, there's some ways you can automate that and instrument your processes and develop things to make that easier, but VEX doesn't solve that for you. If you've got an answer or you want to give people under investigation, or you've got a solid no answer, that's fine. VEX will help you convey it, hopefully in a standard way, but analysis is super important. So, greater adoption is an easy one because it's early, and in 5 years, I think there'll be more of it in some form. But, this whole event, and one of the reasons I was pretty excited about it is we're all it's a mess. I mean, we're not handling things at scale. We have, I'm here representing CVE partly, and can't even name all the vulnerabilities, cannot name the software. We don't understand all the dependencies all connected together. Or the statuses of the things. This is a massive, massive problem. We don't have an architecture we all share. So any improvements, I'm looking for piecemeal improvements, and VEX, right? Even if it's a very narrow, I can say that my piece of software with my upstream dependency has a status, small improvement, still great, still a win. I think I'm hoping to see wins like that continue for 5 years. I'm not sure we'll solve the large architecture problem in 5 years though.
What I hope to see and what I think needs to happen is just like a collective change of mindset throughout the ecosystem, not only about VEX, but there's if you missed it or you forgot about it, in late 2022, CISA published a blog post. Our executive assistant director for cybersecurity, Eric Goldstein, The title of the blog post says it, Transforming the Vulnerability Management Landscape. I think that is the essence, the ethos of this conference. And I think it aligns quite well. Some of the, the things that we're emphasizing at CISA, one of those being VEX, one of those being CSAF, one of those being KEV, SSVC. You've heard talks about these this week. You're going to continue to hear talks mentioning these. I think that I would love to see and hope to see just this collective mindset that we need to, the key notion of VEX is this idea of vulnerable versus exploitable, right? There's still a very large misconception of I think the value of VEX is it tells you it goes from potentially vulnerable to actually vulnerable or actually at risk. We'll use the word risk instead of vulnerable. Potentially at risk to actually at risk. And that's the real value of VEX. I think throughout the ecosystem, I don't, we asked at the beginning, who's heard of VEX? And we saw quite a bit of hands. Hopefully leaving this conference, everybody can raise their hand because I think all of us have said it. VEX is not a new concept. We all mostly exchanging vulnerability information is a manual process in a lot of cases. And so the ultimate goal, I mentioned it earlier, and something we're going to be emphasizing, promoting at CISA is the need to be able to help our federal partners, CISA, of course, and the private sector address risk where they're at risk, and to do that more efficiently to help prioritize their assessing their risk and their evaluation methods of vulnerabilities. We need to introduce greater automation into the ecosystem, and we're talking about some of the tools that are going to help you do that. And so that's what I hope to see in the next 5 years is that, that potential become an actuality.
And yeah, the way I see VEX hopefully in the next 5 years is enabling the voice of the open source maintainers to become a factor when choosing which dependencies you want to choose, and if it's safe to, if your software is safe to run. And in order for that to happen, I see 4 maybe problems that we need to solve. One is how can we create tooling that effectively lets developers transfer the triage and assessments that they're already doing when receiving vulnerability reports into VEX without, like, as seamlessly as possible without becoming an extra burden. That's one, which brings me to the second one, which is, can we make sure that developers don't have to do that triage when it's not their job to do it? If it's coming from other projects, can they rely on that third-party information? Then the second one is, can we make that information discoverable automatically? And finally, can we trust those statements that are floating out there? If we can solve those 4 problems, I can see VEX really proliferating.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen, for your perspectives. I have one more formal question, but we're getting towards the top of the hour. So I want to ask our audience, both physical or virtual, what kind of questions do you have? And if we don't have anything, I'll give you my last question. Oh, I see a lot of people up here. Val, you want to?
I'm actually going to hijack it. So we do have a question online. For a complex distributed product, simplistic view of one status field per CVE, an explanation often might not be enough to communicate effectively. As a side effect, VEX can create confusion rather than clarify vulnerability status in the product. What are your thoughts?
Easy one to start.
I know who sent this.
Yeah, I'm like, who?
Yeah, so I think, this is about sometimes losing some of those nuances on whether you're exploitable or not. And my view is that sometimes you can have that certainty, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can take the risk of doing that assessment, and sometimes if the legal risk is too much for you, you may be off not doing it. Just like my 1 minute answer.
Yeah, and I have a short, possibly technically related answer. The question said, it's our complex product. I'm envisioning there are multiple sort of subcomponents. And it's quite possible each of them is its own VEX status. So VEX is designed to scale as almost as finely grained as you want it to. There's of course a trade-off, but you should be able to play complexity because these components are affected. These are not. These are under investigation. These are null status. You could subdivide possibly. That might help with the response.
Just emphasize too, VEX first. VEX's success to be, realize that we need to remember that the machine readable aspect to it, the automated aspect to it. I think sometimes we maybe out of habit think about it from a human readable perspective. So I think that that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, I know from CycloneDX perspective, you can get down to that level of granularity. And I'm pretty sure that you can do that in the upcoming SPDX 3.0 as well. So, in terms of VEX and being that granular, that is possible today.
Hey, my name is Matt. I'm from Red Hat. So I appreciate open source. To say I didn't would be kind of bad form. Maybe this is more towards Steve. I'm super glad that the different formats are represented on the panel because you did say that format doesn't matter, but I promise you I'm dealing with very real issues today with lawyers over SBOM formats. So I'd say format does matter. And from the perspective of a consumer, I really don't care whether it was OpenVEX or CSAF VEX. I just want to know if I'm affected or not. So from the viewpoint of the consumer with the various VEX statements, is there a risk to the consumer that using one method over another will be detrimental to them? Are there any concerns? Do they share the same information amongst the formats? Where do you kind of see that going?
Yeah, so I think from a VEX perspective, I think the differences are so minor that on the consumers, from their perspective, it really shouldn't matter, right? We all kind of do the same type of thing and in obviously different ways. Now, SBOM format actually does matter. CycloneDX just happens to be both, right? But from a VEX perspective, I think, OpenVEX does a good job. It's very minimalistic. CycloneDX is a superset of that because we've got a bunch of other use cases that we also do. SPDX VEX is going to be kind of similar, I think, to what CycloneDX does today, although as mentioned earlier, it's more of a graphs form. CSAF, I'm less familiar with, but I will say that I've heard feedback, and BSI is actually contributing some changes to dependency track. We will be supporting CSAF in the product hopefully this year, but resolving that product tree can be challenging at times. So with that, from a VEX perspective, in my opinion, it really shouldn't matter. SBOM formats actually do matter.
Can I just add one word to that? Interoperability, I think, is really important.
For context, I work on OSV and I'm neck deep in CVEs and OSV and that sort of space. And I'm an experiential learner on top of things. So when I hear about VEX in an abstract conceptual sense, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. My question is, for anyone who wants to answer it, is what problem does VEX solve that couldn't be solved by a well-formed CV5 record? And are we better off just rallying behind that, given that you have to have a CV record in the first place?
I mean, the short sort of dumb answer is it doesn't support VEX it doesn't support status even currently. I'm pretty sure I opened a GitHub issue somewhere in the CV project to support VEX or support status in a more structured way. I'm sorry, I take that back. The affected array in CVE JSON does let you do that. CVE doesn't. So one thing that CVE does not support currently is the idea of the upstream dependency. So it's one thing, and when my intro material was short, right? Status of this software to this vulnerability is one thing, but it's status of this software because it uses some dependency that has the vulnerability is the trick. And VEX can support both. CVE JSON currently does not support the knowledge of the dependency in a formal way. Yeah, and also we could
Yeah, so to put it another way, you have, and this is the discussion that we had earlier, like after the other talk. The most common use case that you'll see in VEX is think about a vulnerability in OpenSSL. And that CVE is associated to OpenSSL. But if you pull OpenSSL into a container image, VEX is talking about the container image, not about OpenSSL. It will pull in OpenSSL as a subcomponent, but you still need to rely on the OSV advisory, for example, to produce a VEX statement.
So Art, you mentioned the cost of generating and publishing VEX. I'm thinking about it a little bit in the context of SBOMs. So the 2021 executive order basically put the SBOMs into the stratosphere. Everybody was talking SBOMs. What kind of catalyst or incentive you can think of that would actually put the VEX in the same space? So I'm thinking about, for example, FedRAMP. Okay, we can generate VEX, but the government is still asking us for POEM. What can be done to address that?
Well, one of the many hats I wear is I work for a very large technical company. And get ready to drink. A couple Christmases ago, we had a small open source problem logged for Shell. And my organization was bombarded by customers, governments, my peers asking, do you ship this? Are you affected? So if we had our VEX program in place, we could have very easily, as a large commercial vendor, said, this is under investigation. Please stop calling us. We're working on it. We'll get back to you very soon. So from that personal perspective, that's where I see VEX as invaluable, because we weren't ready to issue an advisory because we didn't know we were affected yet.
Yeah, my hope would be, sure, large governments saying things means something, right? Regulated safety sectors taking action and regulating means something. My hope would be that at some point, right, the efficiencies, cost savings, and risk reduction associated with automating this information would be tangible, and people would do it for more or less pretty direct economic reasons. I'm not sure we're at all there yet, but right, the theory is that this is cheaper and higher quality, so we go that direction. Which we need proof of that to start off with. So that's my hope.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the panel. Thank you for the explanations. So my question is going to a similar direction that Andrew's question was going. Do we really want to kind of build up VEX and build the entire infrastructure around it from scratch? Or are we aiming to put that standard and kind of put that information and put it to existing standards, like put it into CVSS, use the CISA role distribution mechanism or the CVE services provided by MITRE to add that information? Because I see a lot of struggle in trying to recreate the same infrastructure that we already built for the other tools.
Very, very quickly, it does not go in CVSS, but it may go. I'll defer to others. Yeah, I mean,
I spent half an hour being evangelized by them.
Yeah,
so
I spent a half hour.
I'm kind of biased.
From the sort of spec minimum requirements point of view, agnostic, right? Very lightweight format focused on just that. We have CSAF, Cyclone DX, right? It's part of something they're already doing. I don't think it matters. Putting it into CVE is perfectly fine if we choose to do that. It's really just, right, you need a handful of fields that are consistent so that we all think they mean the same thing, and affected means affected. But from the spec point of view, it doesn't care where it shows up. Just please do it in a standard way. Yeah.
Hi, this is Aditi Sharma from Dell Technologies. My question is something around what he was kind of coming to around different formats. If you take a consumer perspective, I saw like 4 different formats today for sharing VEX information. Say I am a consumer and I get 4 VEX statements from my 4 different suppliers, all 4 different. How am I going to consume that information? What level of budgets do I need to envision so that I can actually use that information in my infrastructure?
Captured my last question.
Yeah, so I can talk from the OpenVEX perspective. So the good thing about, and this goes about the other question as well, VEX was born from a central idea of what VEX should look like, what information it should convey. So we have like, I don't want to say standardized, but predefined messages that we exchange. And so our interchangeability, as Steve was saying, is pretty good. For example, in the OpenVEX tooling, we can ingest CSAF documents as long as the back to the product tree. As long as we find identifiers like package URLs or chats, we can ingest and generate, like treat those documents as if they were OpenVEX documents. We're still working on supporting SPDX and CycloneDX. We're waiting for some features to come out, which just came out with a release candidate and the latest Cyclo release. So we should be in good shape to just treat any of them as we want. There may be some extensions to how you intermix those documents, but the essence should be pretty much interchangeable.
Yeah, I agree. The tools will eventually mature. Like I said earlier, Dependency Track, which fairly popular open source platform, supports CycloneDX, both SBOMs and VEX today. CSAF support is on the roadmap, and that's being contributed, we believe, by BSI later this year. We've talked about OpenVEX, so that's on our roadmap. So, as these tools mature, I don't think format is really going to matter all that much because we all kind of convey the same information.
So I think the example that was brought up on being able to communicate, not affected or under investigation is one of the things I find really valuable about VEX. I think one of the things that I'm concerned about, which I think a lot of people could relate to, as soon as you flip it to affected, the question is going to be, okay, but when is the fix coming? And I feel like that's something that's hard to communicate via VEX. I guess I was curious if you've heard that feedback from anybody else or if that's been taken into consideration to provide some type of target fix date.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly from the spec point of view, that's correct. That's not supported. I suspect we were trying to stay in a pretty narrow lane and not step into, conveying an expected date isn't a hard field to put in there, but we just didn't, our discussions at the time didn't entail, what are the supplier or vendor manufacturer processes after that. I would agree if something's affected, I want to know when it's going to be fixed, but there might be an advisory format or an outside of VEX option at this point, possibly.
I think that the emphasis would be, that's up to the relationship between the producer and the consumer. I think what our goal and emphasis is helping them do that efficiently.
Yeah, I would like to see a target version, for example, for the fix. Communicating dates, I think, is problematic on a lot of different ways, but maybe a target release, for example, could be a good thing. And then, if the supplier then has kind of the release schedule publicized somewhere, then you'll be able to get a good indication of when that fix is coming.
So my question kind of ties into this. We had a nice discussion about it earlier. When you get a status affected of yes, that's not really all that informative other than yes or no, right? You get, okay, nightmare scenario, yeah, you're affected. So, I work for a company that produces hardware, software, et cetera. And if we could say, yes, and here's our vector, unique to so that in a machine readable format, so that immediately we could put a VEX statement out, and then anybody who's consuming VEX could say, we're not getting, it's not the NVD score, it's the F5 score, it's the Red Hat score, it's the Ubuntu, Debian, whatever score. So that would allow for, as the lady before asked, how do I know how to prioritize? Well, immediate, hey, well, it's a 9.8, we've got it at a 6.8. Let's look at the products that it's a 9.8 and not freak out. So
we will have to table this for Hallway Con. I want to really thank my panel. Excellent job. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Please reach out to them as you have questions, but enjoy the rest of the show. We have another VEX talk coming right up after this. Thank you, everybody.